Hello, everyone. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host, Jacob Berman. Today, I am joined by Dr. Robert Price. I interviewed him before last year when we talked about Simon Magus and Paul the Apostle. I'll have the link to that video in the description below. Now, today, we're going to be discussing the Testimonium Flavianum and the James passage, the two passages in Josephus, very controversial passages, in which it is highly debated if Jesus is mentioned by Josephus at all. There are arguments both for and against the idea that both texts are interpolations, including the James passage. So I'm going to start this off by asking Dr. Price, what convinces you that the Testimonium is a total forgery, despite other historicists, other scholars are claiming that, well, Origen of Alexandria seems to be aware of Josephus mentioning Jesus about 100 years before Eusebius?
I'm not sure that inference is correct. I've heard that, like, well, he says one thing's for sure, Josephus didn't think Jesus was the Messiah.
Right.
Could that be because he said Vespasian was? I mean, that presumably there's only one Messiah expected, and so I'm not really absolutely sure that that Josephus would have been denying anything. It's just that if you knew, he said that the Roman general was the Messiah of the Jews, that, well, that kind of eliminates anybody else. So I'm not sure. It's reasonable. But it's not a silly observation they're making, but it doesn't seem to me to prove the case. That might be hyperbolic doubt. I don't know, but I figure, like Jacob Neusner says, another illustrious Jacob, that what we cannot show, we do not know. So
I see. That's interesting. I never thought about that before. That Origen was simply looking at Josephus calling Vespasian the Messiah, and that's how he responds to it. That's how he reads it, by saying, "Oh, he didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah because he thought Vespasian was the Messiah, not necessarily because he mentioned Jesus." That's interesting. I can certainly see how that's a knockoff to the idea that Josephus had to mention Jesus, because it can certainly be read that way from Origen's point of view. So, be that as it may, does that also necessitate that that the James passage, because they often bring up, well, Origen is very specific. He says that James is the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. They say that Origen's quoting that. Whereas others like Dr. Carrier and yourself would say that Origen, I think the argument goes something like he's confusing Hegesippus with Josephus, because he says something about, and Josephus thought that the death of James caused the war, but no manuscripts of Josephus mentions that. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, it is kind of chaotic, and if you take the Slavonic Josephus into account, which you kind of have to, it
Right.
makes it murkier, but that's no reason to just eliminate troublesome anomalous data. And so I mean, if that was really an actual edition of Josephus, then I'd say, okay, he did mention Jesus, but even there he doesn't use the name. But the Carrier's theory strikes me as very attractive because of the scenario involved. Like, we have to just guess at what in the Hegesippus, I think one of the Apocalypses of James, that version of the story, that we don't know why this would have occurred, what the occasion would be for him to have judicially, well, really just mob violence, lynching James. But if Richard Carrier is right, here is a scenario that is explained and has the right names attached to it, and it would explain the whole thing. And the fact that the brother of Jesus called the Christ, as we are being forever reminded, Christ could mean a lot of things. And did back then. And since the point was, they'll commonly tell you kings, priests, and others were called the anointed, the Christ. Well, in this case, since the point was who is supposed to be the rightful priest, I'm not so sure that this isn't one of those places where that's intended. The idea that it was an interpolation, that's possible, but I hesitate to go that route. And of course, what I'm saying is not provable either. It's speculative, but I do find compelling the idea that the situation of the succession to the priesthood and the political machinations behind that would make a lot of sense about James and Jesus and the household of Annas and all of that. So it sounds pretty good to me.
Could the Epistle of James in chapter 5:6, it mentions that it says that the just one has been murdered who hath not resist you. Could that text be distinguishing the James and Galatians from the one in Josephus? Could that be some kind of... this is a question that I have. Like, could it be that it's aware of the situation that two different Jameses are being confused early on, and it's straightening it out by saying, well, the just one over there is a different guy, but the one in Galatians is another guy? Is that possible?
What would make you think that? Well, he could be referring to either one, I guess, if there was a prominent Christian James, whoever his brother he might have been, and that there was this murdered high priest whose death would have been considered a martyrdom. It really could be either one, I guess. It would make sense if he's referring to... I mean, we don't commonly think of the one involved in the succession dispute, so it sounds kind of odd to suggest it, but people made a big deal of Ananias III being martyred and all that. So Christians may not be too interested in him today, but that doesn't mean that this early Jewish Christian wouldn't have been.
All right. Do you think it's possible that the James passage, chronologically speaking, was the interpolations of the James passage and the Jesus passage in the Testimonium, did that happen around the same time? Or what do you think of Dr. Carrier's position that it was an accidental copyist interpolation in the James passage regarding who was called Christ?
Well, that could be. It's just that I hesitate to say that without textual evidence, but I don't require manuscript evidence when there simply is none available one way or the other. So he could be right. It's just that an alternative explanation was that it just was denoting that he was the proper priest and that it accentuating the crime against him. But it could be. A Carrier could easily be right about that.
So based on the different possibilities of the situation here, of the scenario, so you would say that you are not very confident that evidence can be found for a historical Jesus in Josephus?
I think there isn't in the Testimonium passage. There have been recent studies, like one where the guy shows that in this section dealing with Pilate, in all the other little mini anecdotes discussed there, Pilate is the driving force. It's clearly about him, but in connection with Jesus, he appears like in a subordinate clause. Why would that be? And then there's also the similarity between this and Luke 24. That strikes me as kind of significant.
Hmm.
And also, the someone else pointed out that this appears for the first, well, everybody knows it appears first in a quote from Eusebius, but that Eusebius might therefore have fabricated it, as we think he did with the Epistle of Abgarus and the reply by Jesus,
Right.
because it seems to fit too well into the theological argument context, that he's trying to refute the idea that Jesus was merely a man or whatever, and that he was righteous, he wasn't a troublemaker, and one thing and another, that in the immediate context, it looked like that this was tailor-made to back up his point. And between these three approaches, it just seems to me the thing is dead in the water. And this I regard as just an extreme ad hoc hypothesis to say that, well, if you bracket all the stuff that showed this couldn't have been written by a non-Christian Jew, maybe Josephus wrote that. What on earth? The same people that say this will not allow you to get away with suggesting there are interpolations in the New Testament where the context would indicate it, but there's no manuscript evidence one way or the other. Well, what's it going to be? I mean, I would say case by case you should decide, but they just make it an absolute rule in the one case, but that's the direction they run into automatically on the other. And it doesn't really work that well, because it says that the tribe of Christians, even today, is named after him. After who? It doesn't refer to him as Christ in the shaved down Reader's Digest version. It just seems to me it must have mentioned he was the Christ. And there's no way Josephus wrote that. You can say, well, he was perhaps. You're just trying to make bad evidence into good evidence. You're rewriting it the way it would have to be if your theory were to fly.
I see. That's pretty compelling. Now, if I remember correctly, you say that Galatians 1:19, when it says that James is the brother of the Lord, you say that's an interpolation.
It appears so, because that whole little business about this being his his first or his second trip to Galatians. Well, Tertullian quotes that, and he's earlier than any manuscript we have, right. And he quotes as just his visit, and he doesn't mention the part about Paul seeking the approval of the pillars, which if that was in the copy of Galatians Tertullian had, that is, you could bet your life he'd quote that, because that's his whole point against Marcion, right. That he really was subordinate to the pillars and all that. So it just seems to me that plus there's other weird things in Galatians that strike me as interpolated, and but that really is a howler, I think.
Now, speaking on the argument in Galatians, I know that you talk a lot about Tertullian saying that Marcion found Galatians. You also suggest that Galatians chapters 3 to 6 were written by Marcion, or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So when do you date Galatians chapters 1 and 2 then? Do you think that was written by Paul possibly, or somebody else?
I can't think of the scholar's name offhand, though I reprinted the article in which he said this. It seems like this was written, well, it reads to me as to this author as a Marcionite rebuttal to Acts. That, hey, Paul did not make a beeline for Jerusalem after his conversion, and nobody had seen him there yet, and all that. It sounds like that the writer knows Galatians and is saying, hey, that's just nonsense. That didn't happen. So it seems to me it's later than the possibly Marcion's contribution to it.
So in other words, Galatians 1 and 2 is possibly after Galatians 3 to 6.
Yeah.
And in between both of them, we get Acts. Or is Acts before all
Well,
that?
yeah, I guess so. I guess
Okay.
so. Plus, there are interpolations like this very strange statement that Paul says that Jesus was born of a woman. Who is it? Like, why would anybody say that?
Yeah, that is strange.
Unless you're arguing against a belief that he wasn't born of a woman, he descended from heaven in adult form. So it seems to me we're dealing with a patchwork.
Yeah, it's certainly read that way to me, that whoever's writing Galatians, whether it's authentic or not, it's really strange thing to say that, oh, he is born of a woman, and then not even name the mother. And something similar happens in Philippians, when Philippians 2, 5 to 7, Paul or whoever's writing it is saying that Jesus is becoming a man, very vaguely, and the Father isn't named either. It's as strange to me as what's going on in Galatians 4:4, the born of the woman thing. So when Galatians 1 and 2 were written, so you're saying it's a rebuttal to what's going on in Acts?
I think so. This author's name I can't recall convinced me of it. It's just too close to the. It's almost like what you've got in the Epistle of James, when it's saying, "You shallow man, if you want to be shown that it's by works, not faith." You can tell this writer has Romans open in front of him. There are 4 pointed rebuttals to things said in a short section of Romans. There's no way it's just coincidence, and it sounds like that to me in this other case too.
So based on all that, is it possible at all, in your point of view, could any of the Pauline epistles at all, any of it, or any of the material in it, be first century, or is it pretty much all in the second century?
I think late first and early second century, but in my, I did something I don't think anybody else has done, whether good or bad. In my book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle, I have these mini commentaries on each epistle where I try to show what sense it makes if it's not by Paul. But then, so as not to repeat myself, in a Holy Fable, Volume 3, where I discuss them, I tell the reader, look, you perhaps know my position on this, and I've explained it in that book, but let's do an experiment here and see what sense it would make if you did take the big 7 as genuinely Pauline. What would they mean read through that lens? Well, it's not implausible. And I had a little footnote saying, here's a little bit of a difficulty, and you can see why I'm not so sure of this, but let's do the best we can with traditional authorship. It could be. I just feel like that you might as well explore different possibilities. And the one of the Dutch radical theorists, I find that the things they point to as so striking, like Paul reminding the church of traditions stemming from him, and looking back over stages of growth of the church, that he planted the seed and Apollos watered. When did he write this? It sounds to me like it's a good bit afterward. And various things, the complexity of the theology, the way they try to read the whole thing with salvation by grace through faith into Paul's Damascus Road experience, which is never even mentioned in the epistles, but the fact that they have to try to find all of that on day one, something's wrong here. Can't prove it, but it just seems to me unlikely.
Yeah, I think one thing it definitely shows is that there's obviously a huge problem with the Pauline corpus, and that it creates, it at least shows, at least to me, that it shows that the extreme level of certainty that many scholars have about the authenticity of Paul's epistles is not very well founded. Like, it's not based on firm ground as much as they say it is. That there's a lot of problems they're not explaining away. It's not that it's impossible or that's impossible, but they're not squaring away these other possibilities.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I believe, I suspect the reason is that even though these scholars are liberal Protestants, as liberal theologically as the day is long, they still have this residual feeling of Lutheranism, that Paul, okay, we can throw Jesus to the wolves. He didn't say any of this stuff, but that doesn't matter because Paul is really our authority. And okay, you can shave off half of the epistles, but these are the ones we really need. Because they don't really need it for the kind of theology they espouse, but the link with any kind of mainstream Christianity would be gone. You could say they're Christian philosophers, and I guess they figure that would separate them too much from seminaries and churches. I don't mean to say it's a calculation. There's some insidious reason for it. I'm just sort of guessing that there's a box they cannot bring themselves to think outside of.
Now, could the Pauline Epistles, when it comes to the crucifixion of Jesus, and when it says things, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 2:8, when it talks about the archons crucifying Jesus in the spiritual world, is it possible that the author of the Pauline Epistles, the first 7, if they are the first 7 anyway, could the author be mythologizing Jewish martyrdom and applying it to an angel? And do you think that's what's going on there?
Well, I have always thought it is possible and not absurd. I try to qualify this as much as I can, to think that when he says the archons, or over in Colossians, that the principalities and powers put him to death, it could be that he means that, well, these are the superhuman powers behind the thrones of the pagan nations. And that is pretty much hinted in the book of Daniel, for instance. The prince of Persia detained me, and so who? Well, he must mean an angel like himself. And it goes back to the sons of God thing, as in Genesis 6, but also in Deuteronomy 32, that God decided how many nations he needed to make by counting the sons of God, so each one would have his own fiefdom, his own people to worship him and all that. And that was the beginning of this idea that each nation had a god that they properly worshipped. Like when David says, when he has to go among the Edomites, he says, well, Saul has forced me to worship an alien god. He doesn't say a false god. Or Jephthah, he's trying to make peace. He said, look, why can't you guys be satisfied with the land your god Shamash gave you, and we'll take what Yahweh has assigned us? I mean, there's no statement that you're kidding yourself, these aren't real gods. Well, I think that probably morphed into this idea that these gods were fallen, and that's why their peoples were all pagans. And so it's possible that's in the background, and he's saying, well, it's like Psalm 2, the nations have conspired against the Lord and his anointed, and that he's saying, well, of course their intermediaries were the Romans and the Sanhedrin, but he doesn't say that. So it makes me wonder. And the fact that you have in 1 Peter and in Romans 13, I think it is, these incredible statements that now everybody knows the Roman authorities are appointed by God, and they only punish the wicked, not the righteous. You got nothing to... This person, whoever it was, said... have believed that Jesus was basically murdered by corrupt pagan authorities. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me it may preserve this alternative version that he wasn't done in by mortals, that he was crucified in heaven. I just got done writing an article for the Journal of Higher Criticism, which I think the editor will accept since I'm the editor, where it's called Crucifixion in Heaven, where I say, I think the big piece of evidence for this idea that the principalities and powers and archons crucified him in the heavens is the book of Revelation. Because when we see Jesus, he's Aries the Ram. He's a lamb that was slain because, I'm getting this out of Bruce Molina's unbelievably great book, The Genre and Message of the Book of Revelation, where he shows that every page is permeated with ancient astrology imagery. And we knew that with a couple of the things, like the dragon pursuing the virgin, that's Draco and Virgo and all that. But he shows all over the place it's astrology. And so he says that that Aries is always portrayed in the many ancient depictions as with his head turned back 180 degrees, which means he was a slaughtered ram who they broke the neck first. And then when you look at the fact that there is all sorts of stuff indicating there's a heavenly liturgy in the heavenly temple that is going to descend to the earth at the end of the book. And Jesus is somehow supposed to be the lamb that was slain as a sacrifice to save the human race.
Right.
And Revelation also says the one who was slain from the foundation of the world. Wait a minute, that couldn't have been on earth because there wasn't one yet. And so it occurs to me, why didn't I see this before? And when it even says crucified, like in the chapter 11, the city where their Lord was crucified in Jerusalem, well, that temple would have been in the heavenly Jerusalem. And how did they, what posture did they splay the Passover lamb in? Justin Martyr tells us that they arranged it along wooden rods so that it was crucified. That could be how you got the idea of a crucifixion of the sacrificial Lamb of God in the heavenly temple. So I find this a pretty strong view, I must have gone very far afield from what.
Oh no, it's all good. I liked it. Yeah, the way I think of it is, I wanted to ask that question because the way I think of it is, it looks like Jewish martyrdom is being mythologized. That doesn't mean a historical Jesus at all. It just means, I suppose it means that Paul is the authors, whatever, is taking the idea of crucifixion and attributing it to an angel, and it's being placed in the spiritual world, and when the 1 Corinthians gets the ball rolling there on that idea, if that's the way it happened. Anyway, what are your thoughts on the theory that, like, I know you wrote a bit about Professor Eisman and your thoughts on his thesis regarding the Dead Sea Scrolls and James, the brother of Jesus, and the scrolls and that stuff. But there are people out there that, including him, I think he does this, that use the parallels between the Pauline epistles and the scrolls to date the epistles to the 1st century CE, in like the mid 50s or the 60s or whatever CE. They try to use that to reconcile Paul's epistles with the consensus dating.
Yeah, I don't take that too seriously because it all hinges on who wrote these things. I mean, they were Paulinists at least, and they're certainly representing themselves under the name of Paul, but that was common in ancient philosophy and so forth. And so issue is, do these writings have traditions that were carried on by the, like it says, remember to observe the traditions that I handed on to you. And in these even later works like 3rd Corinthians and the Acts of Paul and Thecla and all that, as Dennis MacDonald shows in the Legend and the Apostle, I think it is, the battle for Paul in story and something. He says that people continued to write as Paul, and that the Encratites had one version of him, and the Gnostics another, and there's a Catholicized, sanitized version. So you have a real diversity in the way he's depicted, which would imply that these various letters stem from later than Paul or Simon or whoever he was did live. Like developments like in Colossians, astounding statement that he says, look, don't worry about me. Yeah, I'm suffering, but it's just to fulfill what was lacking in the atonement of Christ. What? What are you talking about? It was the death of Christ was insufficient to save. Well, this is like some kind of making Paul into a Christ, which is done in all the apocryphal Acts. Those apostles that wound up getting martyred for preaching the Encratite gospel. There's always a scene where Jesus appears in their image and they appear in Jesus's image, and it's like the line is being erased between the apostles and Jesus, and until you've got, like in the Gnostic, the Nag Hammadi text, the prayer of the Apostle Paul. No, I've got the wrong one. I think no, it's the Revelation of Paul from Nag Hammadi. This is it's sort of based on this thing in Galatians. He goes up to Jerusalem, but they mean the Jerusalem in heaven. And I was talking about this to a study group once, and it suddenly dawned on me, the name Jesus or Christ doesn't appear in this. Paul is the Redeemer and the Revealer. And it makes me think of this thing in 1 Corinthians where it says, one of you says, I am of Paul, I am of Cephas, I am of Apollos, I am of Christ. How could Christ be on the level with these others unless this fragment comes from a time when he was one of several rival saviors or apostles? I think these weird little anomalies are fingerprints of earlier stages of Christianity that were largely successfully stamped out. But that's why all the Pauline stuff doesn't agree with it, with each other. Like, who taught Paul according to Galatians? Nobody. According to 1 Corinthians 15, the apostles. Good luck. I was on the phone on a debate with Gary Habermas and Mike Licona for about an hour once, trying to say, don't you see how these are totally opposite? Oh, no, they're just talking about different aspects of it. Oh, boy.
I even admit that is a direct contradiction. There's just no way to... I don't even see how someone could try to bend that. That's just mind-boggling.
Well, it said it was the essentials of the gospel that Christ revealed to Paul directly. And well, look what he says in 1 Corinthians. I preached as of first importance to you that he died for our sins. He rose from the dead. What else is there? I mean, sheesh. It's just amazing. Oh, boy. That's why I have this book coming out, When Gospels Collide. It doesn't deal with the epistles yet, but in that I try to show how to try to synthesize and harmonize all the stuff. You're cheating yourself and the Gospels. These things are different for a reason. The authors weren't just a bunch of stupid dopes that couldn't keep the story straight. There are intended changes here that throw a lot of light on things. But oh no, we just gotta have it all one uniform thing. Don't even know why we have four, but Sheesh. Hmm.
Now, now the next question I want to ask is about the Ascension of Isaiah, because that text is lately has been I've been looking at it some more, and what are your thoughts on the dating of that? Scholars are very divided. Like some of them will put it in the late first century CE, in the final decades of the first century CE, while others will say second century CE, maybe early or mid. And some others will say even early third century CE, because the first time it's mentioned, I think they said it was Jerome. It's the earliest guy that mentions the Ascension of Isaiah.
One of the only things I can think of to help date it is the scene where you have the Father in heaven, and on one side of him is the Son, and on the other is the Spirit, but they're in distinctly subordinate positions. So is this a kind of proto-Trinitarianism? It doesn't have them all equal. And yet they're all there on divine thrones. I wonder if you could coordinate that with the kind of Trinitarian discussions or proto-Trinitarian discussions in Irenaeus and Tertullian. It seems to me somewhat like that, because they have like economic Trinitarianism, and with Justin Martyr you got an angel Christology and the Shepherd of Hermas. You have this weird thing where the Holy Spirit is the Son of God, the true Son of God, and he asks the Father, at whose side he sits enthroned, Jesus was such a faithful servant, why don't you adopt him as your second son? He says, by golly, I will. And Jesus ascends to become the other Son of God. I mean, we're on our way to the Trinity here, but we're not quite there. And the Ascension of Isaiah sounds like the same sort of groping in the dark. But I don't know. I mean, even if you can put it along a trajectory of evolution, that doesn't necessarily date the text. It just might be an earlier view preserved. But I don't know. I don't really know the fact that Jerome was the first to mention it. You can't prove it was earlier, but you can't assume that it was just written the day before either. That drives me insane for other things I look at, the documents, like the Gospels. I kind of think they're written shortly before Irenaeus lists them all. But who knows? It could be, I don't know. It takes a lot of study, and even then you can't be that sure. I can't anyway.
Now, the Gospels being shortly before Irenaeus, that involves, I'm assuming that involves Marcion priority. That the four canonical Gospels are after Marcion.
Yeah, I think that an older scholar, probably in the 19th century, said this. I can't think of who it was. That Luke was writing, the Theophilus he was dedicating the two books to was Theophilus, the Bishop of Antioch, which would place it well within the 2nd century. And independently of that, David Trobisch has argued that the 27-book edition of the New Testament that Athanasius made required in 367, whatever it was, that this was not the first time this was compiled. It was just the edition was now made official, but that somebody in the middle of the 2nd century had put it together. And he says that's partly because of the nomina sacra and the order of the books and the relation to the Septuagint and so forth. He says this looks like someone's authoritative edition, and he kind of builds on John Knox in his book Marcion in the New Testament, and Hans von Kampenhausen also, saying that it looks like our canon was an attempt to respond to the Marcionite canon of the one gospel and the 10 epistles by saying, well, everybody likes that stuff. We've avoided it until now, but let's sanitize it with a few interpolations here and there and add other books. And Winsome Monroe, in a great book called Authority in Paul and Peter, shows there are good arguments for showing these sanitizing, domesticating passages and added to the Pauline epistles written by whoever wrote the pastoral epistles. Well, now it's long been argued that the pastorals were the work of Polycarp. And let's see, you can also argue that whoever wrote the pastorals wrote Luke and Acts. And I think, I can't think of the guy's name offhand. And I defend that in my book, The Widow Traditions in Luke and Acts. Now, when Polycarp, well, he'd be the only guy we know who would have had the motive and the ability to produce this, Trobish says. And so he nominates Polycarp as who prepared the edition. Well, so he decided we've got to have more than this gospel, but he padded the Gospel of Luke by putting Old Testament leaning material in it to make it not Marcionite. And I think, let me see. I think you can see the Marcionite hand in Matthew's gospel, which on any reading appears to have at least 2 stages of composition stemming from different factions in Antioch, where I think it was composed. And one of these was a strict Jewish Christian view, and I think Polycarp added something by them. The keynote speech, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, now don't go thinking, implying, as some do, that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. Oh, far from it. I've come to fulfill them. And if anybody says you don't have to, well, he'll be the lowest on the totem pole in the kingdom of heaven, and so on. But who says Jesus? I mean, this is a Christian opinion, he's saying. Don't listen to those who say, I'll tell you why Jesus came. He came to abolish the law and the prophets. Well, this isn't Paulinism. This isn't the law has served its purpose and it's been superseded in one respect, ceremonialism and all that. No, the law and the prophets, he's talking about the Jewish scriptures, the whole thing. I mean, who says that? Marcion says Jesus came to abolish the law and the prophets. So I kind of think Polycarp had a hand in that. Well, with John, there's even an old tradition that Marcion was the amanuensis of John in his old age, and he dictated the gospel. Marcion wrote it down, but added stuff. And when John saw it, he said, what the hell is this? I never said this. But apparently it was too late to do anything about it, because this is an after-the-fact way of explaining how all these critical things still exist in it. Right. But does that mean, I mean, like, no one has ever seen God except the Son. Moses never saw him. Isaiah never saw him. Well, wait a minute. It sounds like you're negating the whole Old Testament. Who does that sound like? And finally, Stephen Fuller argues that this is, I realize this is pretty tenuous, but I find it just so powerful. He thinks that the secret gospel of Mark text was part of the original Mark, like Helmut Kester and John Dominic Crossan and others think. And he says that this added material sounds so much like the gospel according to the Egyptians that Clement of Alexandria quotes, and that was attributed to Basilides, that he thinks Basilides wrote the Gospel of Mark in this longer version, and that when Marcellina, who was a Basilidean Gnostic, went to Rome, when Polycarp was there, she probably showed that gospel to him, and he said, well, there's a lot of good stuff here. But of course, there's some bad stuff too. And he must have made a copy and domesticated that. And so we have all 4 gospels that have been supplemented and edited by Polycarp in the middle of the 2nd century. Now, I know that is all very speculative, but it's based on suggestive, anomalous data that don't fit the usual story. And I figure where there's smoke, there's fire, as opposed to the apologist's attitude, yeah, there's smoke, but there was no fire. I mean, I know I'm in the Badlands here with all this, but it just strikes me that you have to connect a bunch of dots. You have to try to restore the whole mosaic from a few color tiles, but it's all speculative. It never can be anything else, but it's worth speculating about. And that's kind of what I think these days.
Well, that was a very interesting. So, could the secret gospel of Mark? Because when you brought that up, this idea just ran through my mind. Could the secret gospel of Mark that Stephen Huller is talking about, could this be the Mark that Papias was referring to? Because he said that there was a Mark and a Matthew. Well, 2 versions of Matthew.
It could be. David Friedrich Strauss, already in the 19th century, said, hey, let's not be hasty here. We don't know if he was talking about our Matthew and Mark. There were probably other books given that authorship. We know there were with Matthew. And so, or he says that Mark wrote down what Peter said. Could he have been talking about the preachings of Peter, an Ebionite work? We don't know, but it certainly kind of sounds more like what he's saying than our Gospel of Mark does. So it's not as simple as people, for even residual theological reasons, would have you believe. It's just that it becomes uncontrollable speculation, and people are not comfortable with that, in my opinion. So it's got to be like my friend Bart Ehrman, I think is an example. That's how I read him anyway. I'm no mind reader, but he was his dissertation director was Bruce Metzger, who, though brilliant, was certainly a fundamentalist, basically. And I have the impression that Bart is just very slow taking a second look at some of these things. Like until recently, he figured that the discovery of the empty tomb by the women disciples was historical fact. But then recently said, nah, I guess not. And I'm interested to see where he's going to go in the future, because one thing tends to lead to another.
Right. Exactly. I know he's also, when you had that debate with him, he was, he acted like he was very shocked when you were saying that the Galatians 1:19 is a forgery, and he said that, oh, well, we have it in every manuscript we have. It's secure. He said something like that.
Well, that doesn't persuade him with Josephus.
Right.
I just don't think he's leaving out the fact that he shows that the textual variants come faster and thicker the older the manuscripts, implying that they didn't yet hold them in such absolute veneration and took extra care to make sure they got everything right as time went on. So you would expect to find any unattested interpolations back in the period from which no manuscripts survive. So you're kind of stuck. I mean, you can either transform what ought to be agnosticism into fideism, which is what everybody does, that, well, we can't prove the traditional view isn't true, so we're entitled to go ahead assuming that the traditional view is true. No, you're not. No evidence is no evidence. You can't just assume that. And it's like Benjamin Warfield saying, "Well, we don't have the autographs anymore, but we can be sure that if there seems to be an error in our copies, it wasn't there in the original." Well, how? Have you got a time machine in the garage? You're going to go back and look? I mean, people always do that. Well, we don't really know, so we can assume the traditional view. No, you cannot.
Yeah, I look at these epistles, and when they're putting the letters before 70, and I see all these different authors talk about it, to talk about what James believed and stuff like that, and I have to say what I will say is, one thing that's got me thinking lately is I'm looking at all these different theories about what Paul and James believed, and it looks like it is like really, really bad speculation all across the board, and they're not really explaining the contradictions across what they claim is the authentic Pauline epistles. And even I myself, I tried to imagine some things like in harmony with things that Josephus is talking about, but it really doesn't fit. I'm like, lately I've been leaning towards a later dating with the epistles myself, and I'm like, I just don't really find their argument convincing. I just don't. But anyway, I want to go back to the Ascension of Isaiah real quick. Could that text reflect an earlier tradition that the text is trying to harmonize? Like, others will note that the Ascension of Isaiah contains Matthew's nativity story about Jesus, but it also claims that Jesus was crucified in heaven. You got Isaiah going.
Where does it say that? I know Richard says that, and I've read it over and over again. I'm not sure where it doesn't look to me as if it says that clearly, but I must be missing something.
I actually don't remember precisely where it says it.
I'll take another look at it.
I just remember reading it. But yeah, the text was odd. It was a little confusing somewhat. Like, okay, so at one point Jesus is a man, but then he's like a total angel. It's really weird, and it looks like it's a garbled compilation of different traditions. They're trying to say, well, what Paul believed and what the Gospels believed somehow is the same. It looks like it's trying to make that blend. But what's interesting is, despite that, it also fails to mention Pilate. So it looks like it's prioritizing what Paul believed over what the Euhemerist and the Gospels believed at the same time. And that's why some people will say, okay, we can't say this text is totally docetistic, because it contains Euhemeristic elements here and there, at least in the form that we have. Although, from I remember, Dr. Carrier says that the Joseph and Mary story that was added in the Ascension of Isaiah, he says that was added in later. He says that's an interpolation, from what I remember. Because I spoke to him recently in a, I guess you can call it a dual interview. And he said something like that.
Yeah, I got to take a second look. I mean, I guess it's generally accepted that the martyrdom of Isaiah originally was not part of the Ascension of Isaiah. Well, who knows what else might have been added to it. But I got to take another look.
That's true. Let's see here. Could apocryphal tradition, because there's a lot of apocryphal traditions about the death of James, saying that he was stoned to death, and in the Clementine recognitions, and I've discussed this before, that it says that Paul murdered James, but and Josephus, Ananias murdered James, and it looks to me, would you say that these later apocryphal texts are confusing the James that Josephus is talking about with the one in Galatians. And therefore, recognitions is confusing Ananias with Paul because it confuses James and Josephus with the James in Galatians.
That's pretty interesting, especially since Paul owes his conversion to an Ananias. Or they, I don't know, it's like two sides of the same character. It could be, because I think you're right. The best guess about why stoning in one and what is it? According to one, he gets shoved down these stairs and his brains beat out with a long club.
Did you want to finish?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So Professor Eisenman says, as you know, that the Stephen in Acts is an imitation of the James that Josephus is talking about. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Hans Joachim Scheps was the first to suggest that. And I don't know if Eisenman credits him with that or not. I don't remember.
When I went through James above for Jesus, it didn't look like he did, but I remember. I mean,
he may have just come up with it independently. But it's also interesting that he thinks that the choosing of Matthias as the new member of the 12 is based on the election of James to be.
I think I remember seeing something like that.
And I think that in the Stephen thing, there's a big hint where he says to the Sanhedrin, let me actually look at this. I'm going to trust my failing memory. In Stephen's speech. Let's see. Yeah, okay. In 751 and following, you stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did not your fathers persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, or the just one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. Well, of course, that's in the present narrative context. That's supposed to mean, oh, yeah, you murdered Jesus recently. But now you wonder if this is a wink to the reader that this is originally about the just James, right. and they're on the verge. This is it. Now you're murdering me. I wonder if that's I can find it so tempting to think that this is a sign that was about James.
And that would go really well with James 5:6 about the murdering the just one.
Yep.
And that right there, I would say is the best evidence that I can find that the James and Josephus is being referred to in the Epistle of James as being distinct from the one that Paul, whoever it really was, in Galatians, arguing with James, whoever that really was. So that's actually part of my theory about Ananias. And I know that some people on Myth Vision, they've asked you questions about Paul and Ananias, referring to something I was talking about. I don't believe that Paul and Ananias ben Ananias, the guy in Josephus, are the same person. What I think is happening here is there's someone being winked at in the text, whether that's the historical Paul or not, that is being adopted as the son of Ananias. And what's happening is in that right there, I'm still working on it because then Bayanist gets involved, and that's I'll have to discuss that another time. But it looks to me that the mentor got confused with his pupil spiritually, and then in the Apocrypha, which is a mess about this, it says, well, you know what? Paul murdered James. Because now it's going with the idea, at least for how I see it, that the mentor and the pupil are spiritually the same guy. And they forget about Ananias murdering James, the one Josephus is talking about. And the new Ananias is now the murderer of James. And that's what it looks like is happening there. In Acts 9 is really strange to me. You got Saul going to you got Saul going to Damascus, and he sees Ananias at Damascus, who was having visions of Jesus like he will in the story. And he's requesting letters from some people in Damascus. I guess he gets it. And then after he meets Ananias, he goes from Saul to Paul. And I'm like, oh, that's really strange. It looks like he just got spiritually adopted into the fold, into the flock of Ananias in the story. And in this affects the Apocrypha's reading of it later, and it says, you know what, I think now we gotta say that guy murdered James over there. And that's what it looks like is happening to me, and that's essentially my theory. Now,
Fascinating.
I will admit earlier it came across like it wasn't as thought out as what I'm articulating to you now. So it came across like I was saying the guy in Josephus is the same one in the letters. I'm like, oh no, that's not. I didn't intend for it to go that way. But it looks to me that there's a story being intertwined with Paul about someone being adopted into the flock of Ananias, and that's what it looks like is happening here, at least in the story. And that would affect, again, like I said a moment ago, that's what will ricochet to the Apocrypha.
Fascinating. This is just the kind of stuff I love having in the Journal of Higher Criticism.
Yeah, I definitely will finish that article, and I also, I guess I'll bring this up to everybody now. We plan on doing a show. Remember, I discussed this with you in the past, with myself and you with Valiant about this. We gotta get that scheduled, because he's been very interested in this theory as well. And I think it'd be really good to have the three of us come together on this soon. But yeah, I think that right there, I think that's a good ending to this recording. But yeah, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
Really awesome. This was a really good conversation. We got.
Very fascinating.
And to the viewers, if any of you haven't subscribed yet, please do like and share. Check out the Patreon and the PayPal if any of you want to do that, and I'll see all of you later. Thanks for watching. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.